global refugee crisis, a test for the United Nations? In the interview, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, António Guterres.
Commissioner Guterres, the number of refugees worldwide in 2012 is set to reach the highest level this century. And one of the major reasons for that is the unfolding and very grave crisis in Syria. What can you tell us about the latest situation on the ground in Syria?
It's not only Syria, it's the fact that we have today 4 simultaneous refugee crises. As we speak, there's people fleeing from Syria, from Mali, from Sudan, South Kordofan and Blue Nile, and from the Democratic Republic of Congo, not to mention all the old situations that are persisting. But Syria is indeed the most well-known crisis, the one that opens the news every day. Altogether, I think we have clearly more than 600,000 Syrians that have fled the country. And that is to be combined with 2.5 million people inside Syria in need of assistance. So that shows how dramatic the humanitarian situation is. And worse than the humanitarian situation being dramatic is the fact that people do not see an end to the crisis, and we feel that it goes on and on.
And it could get worse still, because it's evolved now into a civil war. Winter is coming on.
It could get worse. As you said, winterization of the different refugee settlements in the region is now the big priority of the international community. And there is a risk of spillover of the conflict that, of course, requires a lot of attention from the international community and a lot of solidarity with the neighboring countries that host refugees. Jordan and Lebanon are countries that have economic difficulties, that have a situation that requires international solidarity, not only to support refugees, to support the countries themselves. Turkey is making a huge effort. Of course, Turkey is a more powerful country, but I think Turkey also deserves the solidarity of the international community. And in Iraq, let's not forget, Iraq has the history that we all know.
Let me interrupt just for a second, because when you talk about solidarity and when you talk specifically about Turkey, Turkey is getting impatient. Turkey is getting impatient with Europe and getting impatient with Germany. Let's be honest.
I wouldn't say impatient, but I think that the countries of the region believe that it is important to receive clear political signals of support and clear demonstrations of concrete solidarity.
Turkey's EU minister, for example, Egemen Bayish, has said Europe has to help people who need a safe haven, and he went on to say it's time for Europe to finally help out. That sounds like impatience to me.
And indeed, I think it's very important that not only Europe supports these countries, helps them cope with the challenge, and supports all the humanitarian actors that are on the ground helping the refugees, but also that Europe keeps its borders open to Syrians that come to Europe and ask for asylum, and helps some of the Syrians that want, for instance, to join members of their family that are in Europe and want to come to Europe, helps them do so. And for Europe to be prepared if things get worse and if the situation gets out of control, for what we have done with Iraqis. It's still early to do so with Syrians, which is for a more relevant resettlement program from the countries of the region. For the moment, I think most of the Syrians want to be there, to go back home as soon as the situation allows. But if things get worse in the future, we will need to think, as we did with Iraqis in the past, we will need to think about a more relevant resettlement program.
We've talked about Syria. Let's talk a little bit about Mali, because you mentioned Mali. It's a crisis of similar proportion to what is going on in Syria, but it doesn't get quite as much visibility in the media, which I think is a bit of a problem, because it is a huge crisis. There's an Islamist reign of terror in northern Mali, as it's been described, and people are fleeing in huge numbers. Tell us about that problem and how you see it.
There is a humanitarian dimension, which of course is the one in relation to which we act upon. We have refugees in Mauritania, refugees in Niger, in Burkina Faso, and these are countries that are much more fragile from the economic and social point of view, in the middle of the Sahel, with the food security crisis already on top of everything. And so, indeed, the humanitarian dimension is dramatic, and it requests a lot of international involvement and solidarity. But there is, looking at Mali, a complex and dangerous security threat that goes beyond the region, in my opinion. You have today a territory as big as France, northern Mali, that is totally under the control of either rogue groups linked with different organizations considered to be terrorists or similar. And you have criminal gangs, you have drug trafficking, people's trafficking and arms trafficking, generating a lot of money. So this is, it's a very serious situation. I think there is a risk of a cancer in a very fragile environment where states have not the same capacity, the same security capacity that exists, for instance, in Europe. There is a strong risk of a constellation of crises from Libya to Nigeria, from Mauritania to Somalia, to get more and more interlinked. And these would represent, in my opinion, a very serious threat to the region, but also as far as Europe. And that is the reason why I believe we need a much stronger political and economic engagement in the area, support to the humanitarian needs that are on the ground, but also guarantee that a political solution is found.
Okay, you're talking about support, you're talking about financial backing, you're talking about political backing for what you describe as a global humanitarian crisis that has now reached a level unmatched in recent history. My feeling is, however, you're not getting that support because your organisation, the UNHCR, is also facing an unprecedented crisis.
Well, we have been able to get for 2012 more or less the same level of support of 2011. The problem is that the activities have multiplied because we have these 4 crises I mentioned that are new. But remember the crisis of last year. The Somalis that fled last year from Somalia are still in Kenya, are still in Ethiopia, are still in Djibouti, are still in Yemen, and they need to be supported. Mm-hmm. The Yemeni crisis still has a huge humanitarian impact that we need to take care of. Even those that fled Cote d'Ivoire are now going back, and they need to be helped when they go back. And then you have the Afghanistans of this world, all the other crises that still require the same kind of engagement from UNHCR and from our partners in the humanitarian. And so what we have is a situation in which, fortunately, coming out of a solid financial perspective with reserves that we had, we were able to increase activity with the same level of funding, but there is a limit. At a certain moment, there is a limit in which you cannot do more because your resources are exhausted. And we are reaching this limit.
Exactly. And when you talk about the magnitude of the problems you're facing growing, what we're talking essentially about conflicts that result from hostilities, from civil wars and that kind of situation. But you're going to have resource wars in the future. You're going to have conflicts that are triggered by environmental factors, by population growth. How worrying is that to you for the medium term?
It's very worrying. I think if you look at the global megatrends, population growth, urbanization, water scarcity, food insecurity, everything enhanced by climate change, that is probably the defining factor of our times. The world is getting smaller and smaller. There are, for the first time, physical limitations to economic growth. And all this is conspiring to, first of all, increase tension, generate conflict, but also to deteriorate the environment in large areas of the world and forcing people to move. Now, some of these people, because they flee a war, can be covered by the present legal instruments of protection, like the 51 Convention, but others are just leaving because they no longer can sustain their families in areas that, for instance, have been victims of successive droughts, and life is no longer possible there. And that is why it was very important that in the recent conference that we had to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Refugee Convention, a group of states, and now led by Switzerland and Norway, is launching a debate in the international community on how to address the protection gaps that exist in the world in relation to these populations that are forced to flee. They are not moving because they want a better life. They are forced to flee, but they are not covered by the present legal instruments of protection, namely by the 51 Convention on the Protection of Refugees.
Just to wind up, when you're pointing to a future that sounds dire, that sounds drastic, what can an individual like myself or an individual listening to this interview actually do to help to ameliorate the situation?
Well, we can do a lot. We can do a lot in advocacy. You are a journalist. You have an enormous power in your voice and in your presence. You can do a lot joining the civil society organizations that are engaged in these activities. You can lobby your parliament, lobby your government in order to be more engaged in refugee protection. You can network with people all over the world. Today we have, fortunately, instruments for that, trying to support those organizations, those groups that are having. There is a dramatic public debate in Europe on these things, because sometimes people mix refugees with migration, with security. So it's important to explain that it's totally different, the situation of someone that moved from one country to another because that person wants a better life. And I have a lot of respect for these people. But it's different from someone that is a victim of torture, that has fled the country, or a woman victim of genital mutilation in some parts of the world. We have seen this girl that was shot very recently. These people need protection. These people, they are not moving because they want. They are moving because they are forced to flee. And independently of the migration policies that states define, independently of the responsibility to protect the security of their citizens, states have the obligation to manage their borders in a protection-sensitive way, and they have the obligation to give protection to those that indeed need that protection.
Tell me, you are confronted with desperate situations, with people in despair on a day-to-day basis. How do you make sure that for you personally there is more hope than despair?
Because these same people give fantastic examples of resilience, of determination, of courage, and of solidarity. I remember a village in Nimba County in Liberia. Refugees were coming from Côte d'Ivoire. They had nothing but the seeds of the next rice harvest, and they were sharing those seeds with the refugees that were coming.
It's a fantastic example. António Guterres, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you very much.